You never expect your life to take a turn for the worse during a routine drive home. But that winter night, when my car ran out of gas on a desolate road, I discovered how quickly things could go from inconvenient to terrifying. When I was 18, I was immature and naive. I had a reckless attitude on the road, honking when I got impatient and cutting people off without a second thought. Looking back, I realized how foolish I was. I drove a lot, especially since I was attending college 5 hours away from my hometown of Ashford, Pennsylvania. To avoid the usual traffic, I often drove home late at night, cutting the trip down from 5 hours to 3. It was the beginning of winter break, and after my friends had left for home, I decided to head out later that night. I drove a beat-up Mazda sedan and had a bad habit of driving it on an almost empty tank. People often commented on it, but I always assured them that the car had at least 30 miles left after hitting reserves. That night, I was about to find out how wrong I was. An hour into my drive on the interstate, the needle was firmly on E. Instead of looking up the nearest gas station, I kept going, hoping to see a sign soon. The car began making strange sounds and jolting, and I realized I might have finally run out of gas. I took the first exit ramp, praying it would lead to a gas station. The ramp was dark, surrounded by woods with no streetlights. Fearful of losing speed, I blew through a stop sign and made a sharp left turn onto another dark, wooded road. Eventually, the car sputtered to a stop, and the engine died. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. I tried calling 911, thinking it would work even without reception, but of course it didn't. Panic set in as I turned on my hazard lights and waited for someone to pass by. It felt like ages before I saw headlights approaching. I flashed my lights at the car, and it made a U-turn, pulling up behind me. I was an 18-year-old girl alone in the dark, so I cracked my window just a bit as a man approached. He was bald, wearing glasses, and seemed trustworthy enough. I told him I had run out of gas, and he offered to give me a ride to the nearest gas station. With no other apparent options, I accepted his offer. I locked my car doors and followed him to his black Honda, which smelled oddly funky. We drove off, making small talk. He asked where I was from, and I honestly told him I was driving home from school. He mentioned that they didn't get many out-of-towners in this quiet area. The road was flanked by endless woods, and I started to get uneasy. When I asked if he knew where any gas stations were, he assured me there was one just a bit further. As we drove, I began hearing thumping noises from the back of the car. At first, I thought it was just bumps in the road or something loose in the trunk, but then, at a red light, there was silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone screaming and banging from the trunk. My blood ran cold. I looked at the man who was now staring at me. In a split second, I unbuckled my seatbelt, flung open the door, and ran. He tried to grab me, but I managed to escape. Instead of chasing me, he closed his passenger door and sped off. I ran into a nearby diner, frantic and begging for help. The staff let me use their phone to call 911. It turned into a major incident with multiple police officers showing up to take my statement. They asked for every detail about the man, his car, and where he picked me up. An officer gave me a ride back to my car so they could document the location and help me contact AAA for gas. That night was the scariest experience of my life. I was shaken to the core during the rest of the ride home. I hope the police found that man, and I pray that whoever was in the trunk is still alive today. I shudder to think what could have happened if I hadn't escaped when I did. Be careful out there. You never know when an ordinary drive might turn into a fight for survival. Before we dive into the next story, if you're joining us for the first time, please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon to stay updated with our upcoming scary tales. Your support means the world to us. Share these stories with your friends and family. I want to personally say thank you for your support. Now let's continue. It was a little past 3 in the morning on a chilly winter night, and I was exhausted after a long shift. My phone was nearly dead, and I was starving. I decided to stop at the local gas station to grab a quick bite and fuel up. As I ate a stale sandwich inside the station's tiny cafe, I noticed a sketchy guy watching me. He didn't buy anything and left, giving me an uneasy feeling. After eating, I went outside to fill up my tank. The smell of gas was strong, but I brushed it off as just being tired. The roads home were dark and winding, so I drove slowly, careful not to make any mistakes in my exhausted state. Suddenly, the gas gauge needle plummeted to E, and the low gas light blinked on with an annoying beep. I was pretty confused. I had just filled up. I pulled over, hoping it was a glitch, and restarted the car, but the needle stayed on E. I managed to drive a few more miles before the engine sputtered and died. Panic set in. I called my husband, and thankfully he picked up immediately. I told him what happened, and when I mentioned the strong smell of gasoline, he suspected a leak. He promised to come and call our roadside assistance. Just then, a car with no headlights pulled up behind mine and stopped. Fear gripped me as I remembered the sketchy guy from the gas station. Could he have done something to my car? I quickly locked my car and turned off the lights. My phone was at 2%, so I told my husband to text me when he was close. I ran down the road toward the nearest house. It was dark, but I rang the bell frantically. An older man, probably in his 60s, finally answered, looking groggy. I begged him to let me in to charge my phone. After a bit of explaining, he reluctantly agreed. He went to find an iPhone charger while I sat in his living room, still in my nurse scrubs and feeling a mix of fear and relief. From my seat, I could see his reflection in a mirror as he filled a glass of water. To my horror, I saw him drop something into the water before turning off the faucet. He handed me the glass, and I pretended to be grateful, but I knew I couldn't drink it. He asked me to explain my situation again, but I insisted I just needed to charge my phone. He went upstairs saying he'd look for a charger. I used my phone's last bit of battery to send my location to my husband. When the man returned, he claimed he couldn't find a charger. I thanked him and left, making my way back down the driveway to the road. I hid behind the trees, feeling nauseous from fear and exhaustion. I kept checking my phone for any sign of my husband. Finally, I saw the familiar headlights of his truck. I ran out, waving my arms, and he pulled over, wrapping me in a tight hug as I broke down in tears. When we got back to my car, the suspicious vehicle was gone, but my back window was shattered. Someone had been inside, but nothing valuable was taken. My car's battery was also dead. My husband was furious and wanted to confront the man who tried to drug me, but I convinced him to wait for the tow truck instead. The next day, the dealership confirmed that my fuel line had been cut. I took a few days off to recover from the traumatic night. The thought that I could have been a victim twice in one night haunted me. It was a chilling reminder that even in a quiet town, danger can lurk just around the corner. Stay vigilant, even in the places you feel safest. You never know what horrors might be waiting in the dark. It was supposed to be a routine drive, just a quick trip to visit a friend in Fayetteville, but as I sat in my broken down truck on the desolate Route 60, with a strange man tapping on my window, I realized how quickly an ordinary night could turn into a nightmare. It was 2005 and I had just turned 18. I was living in the small town of Springdale, Arkansas, a place where everyone knew everyone and opportunities were limited. The nearest big city was Fayetteville, where I attended the local community college. One of my best friends from high school, Jack, had moved to Fayetteville to attend the University of Arkansas. He lived in a small apartment with a roommate, and his girlfriend often stayed with him. Fayetteville was only an hour's drive from Springdale, so I visited Jack frequently. One weekend, he invited me to crash at his place, so I hopped into my old, beat-up 1995 Toyota pickup. The gas gauge was broken, so I had to keep track of my mileage to avoid running out of fuel. I took Route 60, straight shot from Springdale to Fayetteville. I hit the road around 3 p.m. on a Friday, enjoying the drive with no traffic in sight. I reached Jack's place at a reasonable time, but his girlfriend wouldn't be there until the next day. We decided to make the most of the night. We bought some liquor and drank at his apartment with his roommate before heading to a local dive bar that didn't scrutinize fake IDs. We returned to the apartment around 2 a.m. After grabbing some late night food, and I crashed on the couch. The next day was tense. Jack and his girlfriend were arguing all day, and by nightfall, the atmosphere had become unbearably awkward. I hadn't drunk much, anticipating the possibility of having to leave. Eventually, I decided to head back home. I said my goodbyes and set off around midnight. Route 60 was deserted at that hour, and I sped along, eager to get home. Suddenly, my engine started sputtering. My heart sank as I realized I had forgotten to fill up the tank. I slowed down, but it was too late. The engine cut off, and I coasted to the side of the road. My attempts to restart it were futile. I pulled out my cell phone, but there was no signal. I turned on my hazards and hoped for a good Samaritan to pass by. Time dragged on, and I sat in the cold, watching the occasional car zoom past without stopping. After what felt like an eternity, I resigned myself to sleeping in my truck until morning. I angled my seat back and tried to get comfortable. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard a car door close behind me. My heart raced as I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a pickup truck with its headlights off. No one was in sight. I got out, calling out to see if anyone needed help. There was no response. I checked the truck empty. Uneasy, I returned to my vehicle and locked the doors. Suddenly, there was a tap at my window. I jumped, seeing a man smiling down at me. He asked if I needed help, and I lowered the window slightly, explaining that I had run out of gas. He offered to help and asked me to step out of the truck. Trusting his intentions, I got out, expecting him to produce a gas can. Instead, he demanded I empty my pockets. The realization hit me I was about to be robbed. Panicking, I bolted toward the woods, adrenaline pumping. The man chased after me, but I was fast. I zigzagged through the trees, eventually losing him. I hid behind a large tree, my breath ragged as he shouted threats into the darkness. I stayed hidden until dawn, too terrified to move. When I finally emerged, the man's truck was gone, but my own truck had been ransacked. My glove box was emptied, and my flannel hoodie was missing. Exhausted and shaken, I managed to flag down a passing car. The driver was kind enough to take me to a gas station where I bought a fuel can and filled it. He then drove me back to my truck, and I filled the tank just enough to reach the nearest gas station for a proper gas fill-up. That night was a harsh lesson. Some people will exploit your vulnerability, but others will extend a helping hand. I'll never forget the terror of that night and the relief of encountering true kindness when I needed it most. Remember, not every friendly face is trustworthy, and not every dark road is safe. Stay vigilant and take care on your journeys.